In the last lecture we introduced the basic syntax of Ruby, and it showed one or two of the interesting elements of Ruby as a language, and also gave one or two pointers to some of the features which you'll see being used extensively when we start to move on to the Rails framework. What I want to do in this lecture is to look at classes in Ruby. We started off with that at the end of the last lecture, and now what I'm going to do today is to look into a little bit more detail at accessing and setting values of instance variables. So I introduced instance variables last time and the basic structure of a class. Having introduced how to do that, as you'll see, it's a little bit different to how one does it in other object-oriented languages like Java and C++. Having done that, then we need to place some access constraints on instance variables typically, and I'll show you how to do that afterwards. And then finally we'll introduce a little bit of information, a little bit of a starter on the use of inheritance within Ruby. So three broad topics, but we'll go into those in a little bit of detail, and that'll fill up a whole lecture. So we introduced this simple example from what I've been calling the pickaxe book, as is commonly known, and this is about as far as we got last time. We did two things. We introduced the instance variables themselves, in this case two instance variables, the ISBN and the price of a book. They're deliberately chosen because, as we'll see in a moment, they have slightly different properties. We'll have slightly different requirements for what we want to do with those instance variables. But of course the first thing we need to do is to be able to instantiate those in a new object, and that's where the initialize method is called. I'll say a little bit more about this as time goes by, but the creation process of an object is a two-step process. Typically we don't look at the creator method, that's inherited from object, but what we do is to declare an initialize method which is invoked after an object has been created, and we're using it quite simply in this particular case, simply to instantiate the two instance variables of an instance of book in stock. The other thing which we did was to define a toString method, and this is overriding the method which is inherited, and I'll come back to the toString method in a little bit more detail as we go through and talk about inheritance. So a simple concept of a book in stock which has an ISBN number and a price, and we'll explore that a little bit more now as we discuss accessor methods. So the first thing we would want some other object to be able to do is to access the instance variable. So at ISBN refers to the instance variable, but it doesn't tell us how to access the value of that instance variable. And the next step is to define, in this first case, an accessor method which actually has the same name as the instance variable. That's good practice, sensible. Is not a get ISBN, a little bit simpler. The convention within Ruby is to use an accessor method of exactly the same name as the instance variable. The two are differentiated by the @ sign that prepends the ISBN. So we've got an accessor method here. Define an end to delimit the method, as we've seen in structuring things in Ruby. So often that format is used. And it's got a simple statement in the middle, which is at ISBN. And often when I ask of students, is there anything a little bit strange about that as a method declaration, the response is, well, it doesn't actually do anything. There's no return method there, no return variable there, and so it looks a little bit strange. what that is doing is to implicitly return, as is the convention in Ruby, the evaluation of the last statement in the method. There's only one statement in this particular case, at ISBN. What is returned is the evaluation of that statement. That's simply, in this case, the value of the ISBN number of the book in stock. So 3 lines of code, but it's actually doing quite a lot in those 3 lines, simply by following the conventions which Ruby supports. Generally, declaring an accessor method for each instance variable is going to be a tedious thing to do, because we've got a very clear pattern here. The name of the accessor method is the same as the name of the instance variable. The thing that is returned is the evaluation of the instance variable, and that's it. So clearly it doesn't really make sense for every instance variable to write one of those. And of course Ruby supports that, and so we can declare all of the readable instance variables in a single line using this attribute reader declaration that I've used to replace the instance variable declaration. And now in one line we've got implicitly the instance variables for the the accessor methods for the 2 instance variables declared here. So what we have now in this version of booking stock is we have the 2 accessor methods implicitly available, called in exactly the same way. By referring to both the name of the accessor method and the name of the instance variable with a symbol, that's a semicolon, prepending the names in this case. So whenever in Ruby you see a semicolon followed by some alphanumeric characters, that's a symbol, and that's used to represent a number of things usually. And as I said, in this particular case, it's representing the names of the accessor methods and the corresponding instance variables. So again, as with many things in Ruby, and as we'll see in Rails, by following some simple conventions we can significantly reduce the amount of code we write and write things in a more declarative way. The next thing to think about this is that sometimes we may want to assign a new value to one of the instance variables, and in this particular case we can allow the price to be changed. And in this situation, in this case, we've now written out 2 lines. ISBN is only readable, whereas price as an instance variable, we can get the value of the price and set the value of price. I'll show you in a little bit how to distinguish between those 2 cases, but there is, in those 2 declarations now, there are accessor methods declared implicitly declared for both of those variables, and there is a setter method declared for price, and we'll see how that's used. It has the same name as price, but there is a little bit of syntax which you'll see in a few moments to show how that's actually used in practice. So we can quite succinctly control what sort of things you can do, the policies on instance variables, whether they're only readable or whether they're both readable and writable. Having done that, of course, what we may want to do is to control the access to those methods or to other methods. Normally your getter and setter methods are going to be publicly accessible, so this is not so relevant for that. They're implicitly by default declared as public methods. That's usually what you will do. That's your instance variables correspond to the public interface to a class. But other methods we may want to place as protected, and yet other methods we may want to make a much tighter access control and make those private. Now the important thing is two things. There are two important things about this. One is the exact meaning of those terms protected and private differs slightly but very significantly in Ruby over Java and C++, and the other is the way in which we declare methods as protected and private. So let's talk about the meaning of the words protected and private in Ruby. In the case of Ruby, then protected is very similar to other object-oriented languages. In a sense, a protected method keeps it accessible to members of the family and doesn't allow access by other class instances. So a protected method is only accessible by objects of the same class or any of its subclasses. That's no great surprise. The thing that is a little bit and very significantly different are private methods, and they are strictly used only by the current object. So the receiver of a method that is declared as private can only be the current object. It calls private methods on itself. They're things which it needs to do in terms of controlling its behavior, but it is not possible, as it is in some other object-oriented languages, for another instance of the same class to invoke a private method. The receiver of a private method in Ruby can only be the current object. And to me that makes perfect sense, and as you get used to it, you will also find I believe that it makes perfect sense. It does seem to be rather strange to have something which is allegedly private, but other objects can invoke it. So a very strong difference, and that's important to remember. The next thing is to go on and talk a little bit about how we specify access control, and again this differs a little bit from other object-oriented classes. Not in terms of functionality, but just in terms of simplifying it. In this first method declaration, method 1, then there's no access declaration there at all. It defaults to a publicly accessible method. Suppose then we want to move on to something which is a protected method. What we do then is to use the keyword protected, and that's placed on a line on its own, and then underneath it all of the subsequent method declarations will be protected. So there's no qualifier on the individual methods. We just place the name protected, and then everything that follows will be protected up until we want to change our policy. In this particular case, we've just got one protected method, and then we follow that with a private method. So what we've done is to change the access control to private, and then all the methods declared after that will be private until we either run out of methods or change again. And we can, although you probably wouldn't want to do it as it's a little bit disorganized, but we could change back to public or protected simply by inserting the appropriate keyword and then giving some other method declarations. Of course, if you're sensible and organized, you'll place all of your public methods first, because they're the first things that any user of the class will want to look at. The protected methods next, and then the private methods finally, because those are things which are only of interest to the